Mobile hunters, if you're interested in upping your mobile game, then head to tetherednation.com and check out their saddle gear. There are a few things you can actually buy that will help you become a better deer hunter or give you the freedom to hunt any tree or any situation. This is the reason why I started saddle hunting in the first place and why I use Tethered's gear. I can honestly say that Tethered's saddle gear has changed how I hunt for the better. Big tree, little tree, from the ground, it doesn't matter. I'm untethered by my gear to hunt the best setup for the situation, instead of hunting for a tree that my gear can use. My current core setup consists of the Phantom saddle, tethered one sticks, and the Predator platform, along with an assortment of their accessories. So if you want to up your mobile game, head over to tetherednation.com. If you're like me, you spend lots of time poring over maps, looking at weather data, all in an effort to help predict when and where my best times to hunt will be. It'd be nice if there was a reliable source with all this information in one place. Enter the Spartan Forge app. Unlike some other predictive apps on the market, Spartan Forge was created from military combat intelligence experience tailored for hunters, and stands at the nexus of machine learning and white-tailed deer hunting. No more man-made algorithms. This is a predictive model based on real GPS-collared deer data, historical and predictive weather, and the next level of mapping imagery, all at my fingertips. I've been using the iOS app this season, and it has replaced all my other mapping tools. Visit SpartanForge.ai and sign up today, or head to your iOS or Android app store. Use the promo code TRUTH to save some money and download it today. Welcome to the Truth in the Stand Deer Hunting Podcast, brought to you by Skull Brew Coffee Company. I'm your host, Clint Campbell, and you're listening to episode number 293. Today, we are talking buck bedding trends with Dr. Bronson Strickland of Mississippi State University. So stay tuned. All right. What is up, everyone? Happy Wednesday to you. Hope you are doing well. Hope you are feeling fine and getting all your deer work done, as we are fully in, I guess, full swing now till we get to the season. I'm in the final couple weeks of prep before I get ready to leave for Idaho. It kind of snuck up on me. Not gonna lie. I thought I had more time than I actually do. I think I'm just about 6 weeks out. I think I fly out the 28th of August to meet up with my good buddy Wilson in Idaho. Gonna chase some elk, do a little backcountry camping, hunting. Hopefully some arrow slinging is part of that equation too. But time will tell. I do have all my gear. Everything's good to go. The last thing I needed to pick up was actually a bigger quiver. I use a really small 3-arrow quiver when I hunt whitetails. I just don't feel the need to carry more than that. But as we are backpacking into this spot in Idaho, I'm going to be with whatever I got. So picked up a 5-arrow quiver. Just a tight spot one, because that's what I have on my other bow, and my bow, and I just want to be able to change them, make them interchangeable, because they have the same adapter, essentially how they're attached to your bow. So I just picked up a 5-arrow one of those. That way I could take more arrows into the timber with me, in case weirder things have happened, fall, break an arrow, whatever, rip fletchings off, something stupid would happen to me. It just seems like that's how it works out. But with that, I did do a little bit of deer work this past week. I've been kind of on the mend since I got back since I went on vacation and got back from vacation. I ended up tearing some rib muscles at jiu-jitsu practice, and have been kind of on the mend since. It went from not even being able to put my pants on to actually being able to move. And so this past weekend, or I guess, starting on Friday, I started feeling a little bit better, to where I actually went out to my buddy AJ's shop, Bob and AJ's archery shop, to pick up my new bow, because it was still just sitting out there since I left for vacation, and he had it all set up and ready for me. I just needed to get out there and set up my sight tapes, and it was really the first time I got to put a bunch of arrows through it. I'll say a bunch of arrows in quotations, because I was still kind of on the mend, so it wasn't like I was able to fire off a ton of arrows, but I was able to shoot it like prior to him setting it up, and kind of test it and stuff like that, as I was kind of looking at some different bows. And the Hoyt RX-7, the carbon Hoyt RX-7 is what I ended up getting. And he had it all set up for me, so I went out there and put some arrows through it, and it shoots like a dream. It's an awesome shooting bow. It tuned up really quickly for him, which was killer. The reason I kind of went out is because he was kind of dialing in my previous bow with my MMT arrows from Exodus. So that's kind of what kind of set things in motion. I wasn't looking for a new bow per se. But once I shot that one, I was kind of like, maybe I would like to have a new bow. So went out there and did that. Got all dialed in, shot from 20 out to 60. Got my sight tape set, so felt good about that. Need to do some more shooting with that to make sure I'm just kind of familiar with it and feel super comfortable with it. But at this point, I was lacing some dimes out to 60 yards with that piece as I was getting the sight tape set up. So feel pretty good with that already. And to be honest, I don't think anywhere that Wilson and I are going to be in the section of Idaho we'll be in, I'm going to have any shots that are going to require me to shoot probably beyond 30 yards would be my guess. So that was the one kind of hunting related thing I was able to do, which was nice to be able to fling a few arrows. And then yesterday, when I say yesterday, it's Saturday, I got up the ribs were feeling well enough to where I felt like I could go out and make a venture out. There was a handful of cameras I needed to get out into the timber. And there was one that I wanted to check. And truth be told, the cam check that I did was underwhelming, which isn't surprising. A lot of times I don't start getting my good inventory until later in the summer. August timeframe seems to be the timeframe where I start to get the best inventory of what bucks are kind of around the area. Reason being is I don't really have food sources or anything that I'm playing the inventory game with. It's a lot of setting stuff up in the timber, using community scrapes and things of that nature. So sometimes they're hit and miss, but to be honest, to be fair, I guess I only checked one camera and I ended up hanging 3 additional cameras. And so we'll hopefully here in the next, probably next weekend, I'll get out and do like a more full kind of camera check on at least the local areas. I do have some cameras, of course, up in the Big Woods piece that I've been kind of scouting and stuff like that. Early returns from some cell cameras and stuff like that. It looks pretty promising. At least, there's one really, really good deer that we have on camera that we got. I think it was right at the beginning of July, and he's a tank. So that at least, and there's 2 other cameras that I know of that really kind of produce really good inventory. So I'm kind of banking on those being good as well. But as far as locally goes, not a whole lot to chase at the moment, or not a whole lot to get me excited necessarily. But with that, we're going to go ahead and do some quick housekeeping for you guys before we jump into today's episode. So as you guys know, our buddies over at Exodus kick off the Velvet campaign around this time every year, and it is the official start to deer season, and they like to help get the ball rolling with everyone's summer scouting. I know when Velvet Fest hits for me, it means it's time to get the cameras ready, as I just did this past weekend, but got the last couple out, get them deployed and ready for the season. So from July 15th through August 19th, they'll have some awesome prizes for people who use the hashtag VelvetFest on social media showing their whitetail adventures. Also, if you're in the market for a trail camera, Velvet Fest will be the perfect opportunity to get ready for the season. Exodus will be sending out exclusive savings through their email newsletter throughout the campaign. But to get things started, save 20% on any multiple Exodus render or any render bundle for the first 100 orders. Use the code VelvetFest, all one word, VelvetFest, to lock in these awesome summer savings. Every single camera order comes with a random prize card also. I've been told through the grapevine, that these include some huge deals, even including the all-new Exodus MMT tailored arrow. Over the last 7 years, Exodus has consistently shown they build quality and gear that flat out works, and of course, they have the best trail camera warranty, period. Every single camera is backed by a 5-year warranty and even comes with a theft and damage coverage. That's right. Literally half a decade you'll be covered by the Exodus 5-year warranty. But more than likely, you won't need it because their cameras are already built to last. They also launched the Exodus MMT this summer, a tailored arrow built to your specifications using nothing but the highest grade components, period. Head to their website and use the 3D builder and experience the best shooting hunting arrow available. I actually just shot mine in this past week. They fly awesome. I was actually sighting my sight tape in with a little bit of crosswind, and they were landing. I was pounding X's, and I hit X's every now and then, but not nearly as frequently as I was just sighting in the sight tape. I was actually shooting super accurately in comparison to even my previous bow and the setup that I was shooting previously. So be sure to head to take part in the Velvet Fest celebration, and be sure to tag Exodus in your social media posts because they'll want to see what you guys have going on this summer. So with that, we're going to go ahead and jump into today's show. Have an awesome show for you guys today. I should have had Dr. Bronson Strickland on earlier. Dr. Strickland is from MSU Deer Lab. He works with Mississippi State University, and they do a ton of deer research there. They've done a ton of stuff around, buck movement, nocturnal, how deer react to pressure, things of that nature. But there was a post they had over the course of, I want to say it was like the spring or maybe even like late winter, where they were following a particular deer around and looking at this buck's bedding behavior from October through November. And when they made these posts, it was it caused a little bit of a kerfluffle, maybe you would say, because it really kind of challenges what we think we know about buck bedding and its consistency and all things related. Now, to be fair, and Dr. Strickland kind of talks about this a little bit in the podcast, they are doing additional research around this. This is just kind of the first step in their first findings, which pose a lot more questions maybe than it provides answers. But what you see, in the post when they kind of provided the scatter plot in, and what Dr. Strickland talks about in this podcast, is really kind of eye-opening in terms of how we use buck bedding to hunt and how we maybe, in some instances, maybe not doing ourselves as many favors as we thought that we were doing. So with that, I won't belabor this up front any longer. I'll just kind of jump to the content so you guys can get the buck bedding information as the season is fast approaching. But as always, I want to thank you all for listening. All right, folks, welcome back to another episode of the Truth from the Stand Deer Hunting Podcast. And today I have on a gentleman who, I want to say it's probably been at least 2 years since I've had you on, but I've got one of my favorite people to talk to when I really want to get into the nitty gritty of deer data and scratch my my data kind of nerd itch, if you will. As I deal with a lot of that in my work life data, so it's not surprising that I enjoy that as well in my passion projects. But I have on none other than Mr. Dr. Bronson Strickland. What's going on, man? How are you?
Hey, I'm doing very well, Clint. And as we age, I think we forget how long it's been. I want to venture it's been like 3 or maybe 4 years ago. It's
Has it?
been a while. I think it was pre-COVID when
Wow.
we had our last conversation.
It was
Yeah.
definitely pre-COVID. But man, yeah, time flies, I guess, when you're having fun. Because I know we did I want to say it was like a mini series section together where we did, I want to say 3 or 4 podcasts together, which were
Yeah.
awesome and people absolutely loved. So it's shame on me for not kind of getting back in touch with you sooner and having you back on. We'll just try not to make it so long the next time. How's that?
Yeah, that's just fine. Good to talk to you as always.
Absolutely. So how have you been, man? How was you always like to start off with just kind of how your hunting season has been, at least last year, or maybe even with our precursor to this, maybe the past 3 years. How have things been?
Oh, it's been good within the context of the time that I have. And
Yeah.
that's one thing I'm really looking forward to retirement or some semblance of retirement in the future is that I don't really get the opportunity to do the thing that would really be the most fun to me and what I was able to used to do when I was younger. And that is, chasing a particular buck.
Hmm.
And, I just really, mine is, every week or every other week, you have a day, afternoon or morning, and you just get out there. And I don't really have a way to put all that together strategically
Hmm.
to really go after a deer. So in that context, it hadn't been good at all. But in terms of the other side of it is we eat a lot of venison.
Yes.
And last year and years before, I've been very, very fortunate to harvest numerous does. And this past year for sausage, it was nice. Even though I despise them being on the landscape, I was able to harvest 3 wild pigs,
Oh, nice.
and so that added to the sausage collection we
Yes.
were able to make. So took advantage of a bad thing in that regard. So
Nice.
all in all, very good. I cannot complain.
Nice. When how soon is your retirement date coming up in the near future?
No, no
No.
time soon. I owe off to work I go. It's still quite a ways away. Yeah.
That's right. That's right. What so it chasing a particular buck is one of those things where um, every year I tell myself I'm not going to. And then every year I end up finding one, or maybe he resurfaces from last year, or the prior year that I have some, intel on him about that maybe gives me a little bit more of an opportunity, I guess is one way to say it. But I try to go into every season and try to hunt for opportunity, really, right? And so I'm just always curious, people who really, and I end up usually defaulting back to the opportunity kind of approach, because I'll spend maybe part of October kind of trying to get a beat on a particular deer. And it's happened last year. I played cat and mouse with one particular deer for a couple weeks, and it was, I'd miss him by like, 2 hours one place or something like that, where he passed through right before I got there in the tree that morning, or maybe, right after I left the tree after dark, or whatever the case was. I think the closest I missed him by at one point was like a half hour. He came by a half hour after dark at this location where I was that evening. And so then I usually revert back to kind of just chasing for opportunity, like a good buck, and I'll have kind of a few that I've kind of marked as like those who I'm willing to go after, or willing to put an arrow through. I'm always curious
Yeah.
with guys who that really, really enjoy hunting that singular deer. Like, what is it for you that about hunting that singular buck that really is the thing that does it for you?
I, I, I guess, in my opinion, it would be like putting a puzzle together.
Mm.
It's just kind of figuring out the patterns of deer or a particular buck, and just being strategic about where you go. And it's anytime, and because I prefer to bow hunt. I end up rifle hunting a lot to make sure I get enough venison for the freezer. But it's just really gratifying to hang a stand and be that close to a buck or to deer activity. So I can't speak for all these other people that have a buck on their list and pursue them, but to me that would be the feeling of fulfillment and patterning and being successful at that would be the positive feedback for me.
Right, right. No, I get it. That's kind of always I think is always the rationale that I have for why, I love the strategy part of it. That's why I like bow hunting. I like to get close, especially if you can beat them at their own game. It's, to your point, it's that much um, more gratifying. And I have to imagine, as much as you get the opportunity to, observe deer or observe deer data, it's probably even that much of a stronger pull toward focusing on a particular buck, because you have um, a certain level of knowledge that maybe the average person doesn't have. Like a lot of, and we'll get into this a little bit with around some betting stuff around what is kind of uh, hunter knowledge or colloquial hunter knowledge versus what you've actually observed and what data has shown and
Hmm.
proved out. Right. So it probably kind of entices you to say, like, let me see if, from a hunter perspective, academically, I know this. Can I get this
Right.
to play out from a hunting scenario?
Yeah, that always comes into play, and I like to hunt. Here's a great example. Here's a real good example of what I know, or what the data tell me,
Mm.
and then my behavior as a hunter is paying having more or less confidence about when I hunt based on weather,
Mm.
for example. A lot of that, if I'm honest with myself, a lot of that is about comfort being outside. It's either too hot or it's raining, or overwhelmingly, and there have been a few studies here and there, but overwhelmingly, deer and bucks are going to move every single day. But I just don't think we allocate an equal amount of effort, every single day to hunt them. So that's certainly something that comes into play. And one of the others would be, and most recently with like putting GPS collars on bucks, it's just really difficult to pattern them spatially. Like temporally, you can still pattern them on kind of when they're going to move, but they move around a lot more on the landscape, at least in the southeast, or at least in Mississippi, than we give them credit for.
Mm.
So they're not just always holed up in a particular spot. They move around a good bit.
Right. Um,
And the answer to that is you just have to hunt a lot.
right.
If you just can't go on that one particular time, and you're probably not going to be successful. You're going to have to that particular point relative to cover and in between food and all that. You're probably going to need to hunt that, I don't know, 5 or 10 times before you might have an opportunity. Because he may not be in the neighborhood this week, and he might be in the neighborhood next week.
Right. And that kind of goes back to the idea of what you were mentioning earlier about retirement. Right? Right.
Yeah.
It's not a surprise. There's a few guys that I know, you know, that manage to kill a target buck pretty much every year, with very limited time off, and they're the rare occasions. You know what I mean? Where it's like there's one guy in particular that I know that, like, if he knows that there's a deer alive and he has 3 days, he'll kill that deer in 3 days. It's just almost like
Wow.
clockwork. Like he's that, but he's honed that skill over time, and usually he has probably a couple years maybe of intel on that particular deer. So he's not starting. It's not like he just saw the buck and like is like, okay, now I'm going to figure out how to kill it. Sometimes that is the case, but a lot of times, it's him kind of knowing a buck and going, all right, this year that's the guy, and I've got
Hmm.
3 good weather days to do it, and I'm gonna make it happen. I'm curious, and this is not on the topic of the bedding stuff I want to talk about initially, but are there anything so the hunting kind of I guess general knowledge is right is like cold fronts, when you get a little bit of precip, any type of kind of weather change just in general, like those are typically good days that you want to focus on. Have you seen in like any of the research you guys might have done, are there any are there any kind of really really strong kind of indicators that's going to kind of create movement more so than others that you have found from a weather standpoint?
Not really.
No.
We haven't seen anything that would compel me that this particular day is going to be so much overwhelmingly better than the day before, the day after.
Hmm.
Now, that said, you started talking earlier about data and so forth, but we do see some tendencies. So, and a lot of the ways we'll try to analyze these data is that we'll use at a population scale how many ever bucks on a particular day we have collared, and we'll look at something like daily movement rate. And there's a lot of assumptions buried within that. So we'll have daily movement rate over time. And then what you have to do, Clint, or the way we rationalize is the best way to do it, is you look at a deviation from the norm.
Hmm. Okay.
So if you start and, for down here with our deer season, you go to October 1st to January 31st, you're going to see big swings in movement activity, but it's relative to the rut.
Right.
So over time here in our context, come December, you're going to have movement rates twice as much as you might have the month before. And then in the post rut, you're going to see those movement rates go down. So we have a generalized, like an average line that moves over time. And then day by day, we look at the deviation from the norm. So that spike, what caused the spike in activity? Or
Okay.
what caused this compression in activity? And we relate that to different weather events. And you will end up with some very weak correlations.
Hmm.
But then the next step, Clint, is then you look at, being statistical here, we call it effect size. And that is, we look at how much did it deviate from the average. And so you might, and I'm just making up these numbers here.
Yeah.
So let's say that every single day, the norm movement rate was 4,000 yards per day or 5,000 yards, whatever. And then we have the spike that is related, correlation, not causation, but it's correlated to a weather event. And that spike is another 250 yards.
Hmm.
So on average, they're going to be moving, let's just say, 4,000 yards, 3,000 yards. And on this good quote, air quote, good day, they moved another 2 or 3 or 400 yards.
Right.
Well, that's very, very different than saying the deer were really moving this day or the deer were shut down and not moving at all. That is not what we see with the data at all.
Right. Right. Yeah, and I think when you look at it from, I guess we'll talk about movement here for a second. So like the October lull, right? That's one of the things that you hear a lot of people talk about. And a lot of people stay out of the woods during that time frame. Actually, it's personally become probably my favorite time to hunt. Um, because I'm dealing with a lot fewer people usually in the woods
Hmm.
at that time. The deer are shifting, food sources are shifting significantly, particularly, during that period. They're also starting to ramp up just like a little bit in terms of um, getting ready to hit that kind of pre-rut kind of stage. And so like it's probably one of the last times for me that I can predict based on my scouting what might happen before kind of, all heck kind of breaks loose, so to speak. So can you talk a
Right.
little bit about what you have seen just in terms of movement in general throughout the season, and particularly the October lull? Because my understanding is, and what I have seen, observed as a hunter, is that I still see a fair amount of movement, actually more movement than what, most would probably anticipate or think in that kind of October, let's call it like the 10th through like the 16th or 17th. Like I actually find a lot of it's not in fringe areas, it's really kind of in core areas is what I've personally found. But what have you
Hmm.
guys seen from the data in terms of movement around that time frame?
Let's frame something up
Yeah.
first. Is for a lot of the U.S. that works to say quote October lull.
Hmm.
If we were going to say that in Mississippi relative to say the time clock from the Midwest, we would have to call it the November lull.
Right. Got
And
it. Yeah.
so, Clint, like where you're at, where is the peak of the rut relative to October
Usually I think the peak breeding date is right around, I want to say like the 6th, if I'm not mistaken, of November.
of November
Yeah. 5th,
of
6th, like that,
November?
yeah, that time frame I think is the peak breeding date.
Yeah. Okay. So we're about a month to 5 weeks behind you. So what we see, which again can be in direct conflict with a lot of hunters and a lot of very popular hunters
Hmm.
and TV programs and all that stuff, is this lull takes place. But when we look at the data, there is definitely a lull before the rut, but there was also a quote a lull before that. So it's not like when we end up summer and bachelor groups break up, we don't see a spike in activity and then it dips down and we see low activity, and then of course we see another spike with the pre-rut and the rut. That's not what we see at all. We just see baseline activity that is relatively low and a huge spike up, doubling or tripling daily movements when it comes to the pre-rut. And all that is correlated, with scraping activities and all that sort of stuff. But
Right.
it just kind of all comes together. So it's kind of weird. It's like when you say a lull relative to what?
Right. Yeah.
A lull relative to the rut? Well, yeah, of course there is. But a
Right.
lull relative to September? No, we don't see that.
Right. And I think where a lot of people get that right is they're um, they're basing their activity kind of perception, right, or understanding off of maybe trail cameras that they've placed to capture summer inventory or early
Hmm.
fall inventory, or areas that they might hunt during the earlier part of the season that might be closer to field edges and stuff like that before the pressure gets to, where those are still the primary food sources before acorns start dropping and things of that nature. And so I think it's probably more of a um, consequence of people being in the wrong spot versus
Yeah.
the deer actually lulling, so to speak, right?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. I would call it that there's a change, but it's probably more of a spatial shift in the where the buck is at versus overall his movement activity is less.
Right, right.
I think that corresponds very well with what you've observed, and that and food is changing at that point too. So
Yeah,
when we do see these shifts, they are typically happening before the rut and after the rut, and not during the rut.
right,
It's kind of like once they decide this is where I'm going to be for 2 to 3 weeks during the rut, that's typically where they stay.
right.
And if they're going to, get up and move a couple miles away, that usually happens pre or post rut.
Hmm. That's a nice, like we'll have to keep that in mind as we get into some of the bedding stuff because I thought some of the stuff you guys kind of dug up was really interesting. But I have another personal question about your kind of liking to kind of target a particular deer. So if you're going to target a particular deer, are you going to focus in on, uh, you know, bedding areas? Are you going to focus in on potentially known travel corridors? Are you going to focus in on areas that might be, primary or kind of like scrape hubs or something like that? What would be the thing if you're going to kind of target a particular deer? Like, where is the place you feel most confident that you have the best opportunity for the right type of encounter?
Man, Clint, that's really difficult. Even personally, because I'm not that successful at it. But again, I just use what the data tell us and so forth. There's a real context here relative to the availability of bedding cover and how much cover you have on your property and adjacent properties. So let me give you a very simplified example. Is if there is only one part of the property you hunt that is offering cover, that is very advantageous to you as a hunter because you know where the starting point is going to be. Then it is just figuring out where is that buck going to go relative to either exploring for a rut or for food. But a lot, and again, my context is the South and especially Mississippi. Um, we usually have cover is far more prevalent on the landscape than quality food. So there are more places to bed and hide than there are, quote, destination food sources.
Got it.
So within that context, how would you figure out where he's bedding? And I would just say that would probably start with me using cameras or me glassing from a food source and at least trying to figure out what part of the food plot is he entering?
Right.
What trail or couple trails might he be using? And then via my own explorations on foot and Google Earth, figuring out what are the most likely places he's bedding. And then I don't want to go trampling around in there and disturbing the buck, but at least I think I could narrow down in the 360 degrees that he could be coming into the food plot,
Right.
that it would be coming at least from this direction.
Right. Right. No, that makes sense. So it sounds like, what you would like is to kind of narrow down where he's starting from, where he might be, going to, and then try to find that comfortable interception point to where you're close enough but not going to kind of shoot yourself in the foot, so to speak, right? Is that kind of a fair way to?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yep, exactly. Yeah.
So I know I've kind of alluded to this a few different times as we've been kind of just chatting here, but a few months ago, I was on Instagram, was just perusing through and came across some stuff that you guys had posted that was really interesting information that was related to buck bedding and how many beds a buck is using. But
Hmm.
so just to kind of start, like, what was the and I know you guys, I think, have some additional research planned beyond this. Is just kind of the tip of the iceberg, so to speak. But what was the
Right.
genesis of just kind of these findings? Like, where did that come from? Where did it start from? Like, I guess the hypothesis or the idea to kind of explore this.
Um, it probably started with my bias, and I probably speak for a lot of people, at least my age, that there was always this hunter wisdom or conventional wisdom that there are just a couple places on the landscape where a buck is going to bed. And I'm not talking about like a big like a sanctuary area. I'm talking about specific spots, where a buck is going to bed and that's his bedroom. And, read that a lot, the buck's bedroom where he's
Right.
located. And so I just thought, what a wonderful opportunity. We have this data here. I'm going to get in here and tinker and just see if that is indeed the case. And we can get pretty reliable signals from the data. With our data, we had these collars programmed where they were sending a signal every 15 minutes.
Hmm.
And so when you get, four or five or eight or more sequential locations within an area, 10 yards by 10 yards, you can pretty safely conclude that buck is bedded.
Right.
And so we just started kind of playing around with that and seeing how many bucks, or excuse me, how many beds a particular buck is using, and How are they differing from day to day? And so generally that's really kind of how it started. And along with that, we were simultaneously doing some research on trying our best way to quantify what are the vegetative characteristics that make up for a bedding area versus within 360 degrees at random around the bedding area. What is different about that? Why did the buck choose this spot and not the spot 30 yards northeast, southwest, whatever?
Right.
And the answer was exactly what you would think it is. So there was no Nobel Prize won with the five, and it's just cover. It's just very developed screening cover.
Side cover. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, a buck can literally, stand on its feet or be in its bed, and he is completely, concealed. And then we start looking at our landscape, and these little spots are all over the place, and they're on field borders. They're within a forest. It would be, great management advice here would be just like hinge cutting a spot. These are all places that absolutely can turn into beds. And so we just started quantifying that and following a couple deer and just looking at how many different beds they were using within the day and say over a week's time. And it was just shocking. There was very little fidelity for a buck coming back to a particular bed. He did over a week's time. He may have bedded at a spot twice, but generally it was at a different bed each day
Yeah.
and a couple times each day.
Yeah, that was the thing that I was kind of surprised by. Like, I remember when I actually didn't see the first post. I saw the second post you guys made, and which was kind of fortunate for me because then I was able to go back and look at the first one, so to kind of see like how it the first one and the second one. And I actually messaged my buddy Greg. He's a big bed hunter, and I was like, oh, he's gonna love this, and he's had success over beds. I got a lot of friends who hunt that way. I find beds, but I don't find enough of them necessarily. Like I can find an area where I feel like, okay, this is an area a buck likes to spend I don't want to say substantial amount of time, but more time than he would like to spend in any other place within 300 yards. Let's just say as an example, right? Like this is the spot where there's a bed, there's some concentrated sign, so he clearly likes this over the area that's 300 yards in circumference around this, just as an example, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of
Yeah.
how I approach it because I am not a good quote unquote bed hunter. I have friends who will literally set up on a bed and shoot a deer in a bed, right? And what I
Wow.
thought was really interesting about, what you showed was that there's certainly skill to that, no, not denying it. But there's also like a certain portion of luck as well, just based on the randomness that, and I don't want to say it was randomness because there could have been like wind influence or whatever the case was, but that they weren't as consistent betting as one would think. And I knew from the first post, that first one that I read, I was like, the argument initially is going to be someone is going to ask about rut versus earlier in the year because they say that they're more predictable earlier in the year, and that just didn't necessarily hold water, which I thought was pretty fascinating.
Didn't
But
pan out.
right. And I don't want to bury the lead, but I want to get to that. But the first thing I wanted to ask, just so people kind of know that are listening to this buck was 3.5 years old, which is pretty like an appropriate kind of sample of what most people are chasing, especially if you're hunting. If you're hunting public land, then that's probably about 3.5 to 4 years old. Is probably what you're looking at in most states, not
Mm-hmm.
Iowa or Kansas withstanding things like that. So I thought, and then you guys looked at two different kind of time segments, and this all happened with this particular buck on this particular parcel. So before we kind of dive into some of the nuance, can you just talk a little bit about the general habitat, the terrain, food opportunity, pressure, things of that nature? Like, just I guess give us a little bit of like a Cliff Notes version of this parcel.
Okay. So it is in a part of Mississippi. It's not what we call our Delta region, which is our agricultural region. And so, I'm generalizing here, but I tell people this part of Mississippi looks like Iowa.
Hmm.
I mean, it is, 360 degrees. It is crops, and it is primarily corn and soybean and sometimes rice and other things like that. This where we conducted this study was not in that region, but it is still in a region full of agriculture.
Okay.
And so you may have 20 to 40% of the landscape is agriculture, and again, primarily soybean and corn. So you really have this very developed, matrix of woods, of forest, of upland forest, of bottomland forest, and then where it is conducive, you will have big ag fields. And so it really sets itself up to where you have all the components of a thriving deer population, and also you can grow really, really big bucks. And so it's one of the places in Mississippi. It's a big buck region,
Right.
and for that, and for the reasons I mentioned, you have food, you have cover, you can grow a deer population, you can grow numbers, and you have a lot of food. And so if you were Google Earth looking down, just imagine, don't think of Iowa, but maybe think of Missouri or something like that, where you have forest land, but about 20, 30, 40% of it would be opened up, with agricultural fields.
Yeah, that makes sense. Actually, I'm actually looking at one of the posts now, and it's funny. The aerial does remind me of whenever I was hunting in Missouri. Very reminiscent of
Hmm.
what I ran into there, and that's a great kind of, I guess, proxy for people who maybe aren't as familiar with Mississippi. Um, so what times of year was the data gathered? I mean, I'm supposing that he was collared, so you were gathering it throughout the year, but you guys looked at two specific kind of time periods to kind of compare and contrast, right?
Yeah, so we did a peak of the rut, and for this area, the peak is essentially Christmas. It's centered on around Christmas, and then I got to go back and look about it. Yeah, and then we did pre-rut, which was October. So that's during bow season for us. October 1 through 7 was the other period.
Right. And so it sounded like you answered this a little bit earlier, but you were defining betting by the kind of proximity and time stamp of his movement, I guess is one way to say it, right? Like, so the dots
Yeah.
that are in those areas that were close together, they might have just, like, over a certain kind of period of time, might have just been him getting up, stretching his legs, slightly moving, but that was still like where he was betting for that duration of time, right? Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. I would just add one thing is the way we look at it is, so when we get a location, it is often not precise down to the meter or centimeter or foot.
Mhm.
And so, you're using satellites to triangulate the location, and that's really, really good. But every time we get a location, that's part of the technology, it also gives us an error rate, plus or minus.
Right.
So here it is, here's the latitude and longitude, plus or minus 10 meters, 5 meters, 30 meters, something like that. So essentially, we look at the consecutive locations that are within the boundary of the error associated with those locations.
Okay. Yeah.
And yeah, and just really, I mean, it's not that sophisticated. You can literally see when the points are clustered together, and then when the buck starts moving, it's really obvious. So we can tell when he got up from his bed.
Right. Right. So extracting Dr. Strickland from this conversation for 1 second, and inputting Hunter Bronson Strickland into the conversation. What was your uh, what was your initial kind of thought, like, prior to, like, looking at the data, like, specifically, kind of, as you'd mentioned, like, you kind of went in and started, like, saying, hey, can we kind of take a look at this and pair this in a way that we can kind of understand the betting opportunities? What was your kind of general thinking? What did you think you were going to find, I guess, is the simple way to ask it.
Well, here's how I respond. Here's how I reacted. Was the first response was, "Dang, that's interesting." So there's my academic. That's my academic response. My hunter's response was, "Dang, that sucks."
That might be the most, like, appropriate. That was kind of almost the same reaction I had. Like,
Yeah.
oh man, and so
It's, you just can't pattern them that easily within, again, within the landscape context we are studying.
right,
In other places, I think you can pattern them a lot more easily, but down here, not so much.
right. Did you, when you were kind of poking around in the data and stuff like that, was there anything that you could kind of see, again, maybe not causation, but maybe correlation, that was a uh, a stronger, I don't even want to say predictor because it's not causation, but a stronger kind of correlation to a particular bedding area. Because when I look at the map, there's certain areas that have one visit, one has three, four, whatever the case is, whatever the number is. It, was there anything that you could kind of tie to that increased number of visits to that particular bedding area
Um,
as an influence or as a
it,
correlation?
the one thing, and I have to be careful here because this is where I got to use the caveat that there's a lot more research needs to go into this, and we've only done this with a handful of bucks over a small period of time, and our student is going to be looking at the entire data set over a couple of years. So it's going to be far more in-depth research. But what I could see, and I think our post demonstrated this, it was like when the deer, for whatever reason, because of the proximity to food or potentially the proximity to a doe social group, when the buck decided to bed in a larger block of woods, you would see a lot more spatial variability in where the buck chose to bed in that, say, 50-acre wood block or 80-acre wood block. There might be 3 or 4 spots in there, but there were absolutely spots that were secluded or off the beaten path where he would go time and time again. And so one particular example was we had kind of a fence row, and when you kind of zoom in on Google, it looks like there's kind of a good cover patch that's really developed right there. And it may be a plum thicket or a sumac thicket or something like that. But evidently, it was a place where that buck is going to go and probably not have any interference whatsoever. There was also a place on to the south of that post that in that field there was a low spot, likely holding some water, and that's the very reason it was not cultivated for agriculture.
Hmm.
And so that there were trees, brush, cover, etc. And he would visit that place quite often. And when you look at those places, it's like, man, it would be very difficult to approach those places without the buck knowing you were coming.
Yeah, yeah, because
Uh,
I'm looking at
I'm
that
not going
spot
to say
now.
impossible, but really difficult.
Yeah, because I'm looking at that spot now, and it's so open around it that you would have a really
Hmm.
hard time approaching him to where he wouldn't be able to see you or smell you. At that point, because if he can't smell you, he's going to be looking at. If he's not smelling you from that direction, he'd be looking in that direction most likely
Yeah,
to cover
yeah.
his surroundings. Yeah, I mean, it was to your point as a hunter. It's like, man, that sucks because it's they're not really as predictable as we want to think that they are, and it kind of flies in the
Right.
face not just the predictability of their bedding, because I think the deer hunter wisdom is that yeah, they have predictable bedding, and then if you told someone that like yeah, but they're not as predictable as you think, it's like I think the first response would be like, well, yeah, sure. As you hit like pre-rut and rut, like they become unpredictable because they're moving a lot, and that would be, I think, the conventional kind of thinking. I mean, that's what we've all been kind of led to believe and taught and have all consumed and kind of lived and died by and have probably hunted that way. And it was interesting
Hmm.
when I saw this post because I was surprised to see that the early October uh, data points were way less consistent than the rut data points. And
Hmm.
you could have told me, I would have believed you and not even batted an eyelash if you would have said, Clint, they don't bed nearly as consistent as you think that they do. I'd be like, seems reasonable. It's a wild animal, a lot of variables. They
Hmm.
probably, do a lot of different things that we don't understand for a lot of survival reasons that we maybe aren't, that we don't fully grasp. But I would have had a harder time believing somebody if they said, yeah, they bed way more consistent during pre-rut, the peak of the rut than they do earlier in the year. And
Hmm.
my conventional thinking would have been, well, October, like they're really still just on that. Where's the food source? And I would assume they would bed nearby wherever their food source is. And so even if it is maybe not 100% predictable within like they're going to be in this bed all the time, I would assume it would be in a bed that would be not too far away in the general area. But man, the scatter plot for the October timeframe was just something that I did not um,
Yeah.
I would have never guessed. You know, in the tightness, relative tightness of the scatter plot of the peak rut, it was just I feel like you almost would have a better chance of killing a bedded buck or buck hunting bedding during the rut time frame, based on what I'm looking
Hmm.
at.
Yeah, I completely agree. And we have a couple hypotheses, and that's all we can propose is here are some ecologically some reasonable explanations. But heck, we don't know and we never will. But so when you look at the October data, which again are far more scattered, my hunter slash conventional wisdom would have also been initially it's going to be much more of a pattern that time of year.
Mm-hmm.
It is going to be a lot more like, say, a buck bachelor group, where every single day they're going to this field and they're going to go bed down here. But we actually see a lot more movement and a lot more what appears random. But what could be going on is number one, there's very few hunters, relatively few hunters on the landscape at that time. That's literally when these data are from the very first week of archery season. So there's little disturbance. There's also changes going on with mast availability. So you may have some hard mass, maybe just starting to drop, and a buck is working through there trying to figure out where those places are at. We also have crops. So we have those summer cash crops, what is left in those fields, and then we have food plots being planted. So we also have a lot of variability potentially in food on the landscape with little human pressure.
Right.
If we fast forward that 2 months, everything's changed. What grain or whatever was left in the ag fields that's probably been exhausted. The agronomic foods are going to be food plots. The mass at this point may or may not have been completely exhausted by now, and the deer know that hunters are out there. The pressure is on, so he just may be in fewer places right now because he knows he's being hunted.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's the other thing that I found interesting too is that scatter plot got tighter, but a lot of his it the other thing that flew in the face to me a little bit of conventional wisdom was that it's almost as though his core area got smaller. And you always
Hmm.
hear, you know, a buck they start to range out during, you know, that time of year. I would like it would have made more sense to me if we were looking at a buck that was say 5.5, 6 years old or 7 years old. You know what I mean? Like a deer that maybe is like, you know, I've heard, you know, I don't have any proof, of course, right? But another piece of conventional wisdom is that as a buck gets older, in a lot of instances, potentially, right? Again, this is all
Hmm.
hunter wisdom. That they start to shrink their core area. They know where they're safe. They know where danger is. They have an area that they feel really safe in, and they kind of know where their doe family groups are at, and they're going to kind of work those doe family groups, and are just not going to expose themselves. And which can make it harder to kill them. It can also make it potentially easier to kill them. And so this would have looked like to me, I would have been like, yeah, this makes sense if this is like a 6 year old buck. But like when I'm looking at a 3.5 year old, I'm going, man, that's like a teenager or like a 21 year old. Like he
Yeah,
should be out partying. You know what I mean? Like,
right. Throw
like,
caution to the wind. Yeah.
right, right, exactly. And so that's the other part that really kind of, I guess, surprised me was like how tight his core area was. Were any of these areas, you know? I guess let me ask this question first. So you have bucks that are collared. I'm assuming you have a bunch of does that are collared in this same area too, right?
Unfortunately, we do not.
Oh, okay.
I wish we did. These are bucks only.
Okay, because my you can probably figure out where my next question was going. My next question was is like you know this pre rut or this peak rut kind of area. I'd be curious to know if any of these bedding areas are adjacent, downwind, or how close they may or may not be to where we might have doe family groups that are bedding, especially close to these food sources potentially.
Buddy, you and me both. I want to know that as well.
Oh man, yeah, that's
Yeah.
awesome. Because that was my first
It,
kind of my first thought was that, and I don't think it describes or would answer all like the tightening of the core area questions and things of that
mhm.
nature. It would just be a piece of the puzzle, but it would be interesting to kind of consider. But I mean, based on what you know about deer biology and behavior and things of that, I mean, what would be your gut feeling around like, you know, looking at the landscape there, you know, would you feel like some of these areas are kind of prime locations for, you know, him bedding downwind or close to a doe bedding area?
Oh, absolutely. I have no doubt that's what's going on. I just wish we could quantify it and improve it.
Hmm.
Um, yeah. So, I mean, like if you're looking at that figure, if he's down in that the little cover spot
Hmm.
south of the larger, I bet $1,000 there's a Doe social group located in that wood block,
Right.
to the north.
Yeah.
Um, he's going to be in proximity of that.
Right. Right. Yeah.
And here's another way to think about this, Clint. You touched on some things that are really interesting, and um, we actually we're hoping to get it launched right before deer season. But we have put all of this together, all of these analyses together in a document, and it's going to be free of charge, free to download, print yourself, the whole deal. But we're looking at a lot of this stuff, like and here's one I think you might think is interesting, is that it's the way we talk about the Bucks home range, and there's so many assumptions and the way you kind of think of that. And so what happens is we think that the Bucks home range is getting bigger during the rut, for example. But it's all based on scale. And here's what I mean. When you look at then the daily footprint or weekly footprint of most of these bucks, it's about the same. But what happens during the rut is that there is a shift. And so instead of using 50 acres in one day, and then the very next day using the same 50 acres, is that it may move over. It may overlap a little bit with the original 50 acres, but there's only a little bit of overlap. And so he's using a new 50 acres
Hmm.
adjacent to it. And then a week later, the new. So it's like, are we talking about a daily scale of where the buck is at, a weekly scale, or a seasonal scale? So when this seasonal home range gets bigger, it's just because collectively, all of those weekly home ranges are not on top of each other, they're adjacent to each other.
Wow. What's that's an amazing way to look at it and think about it. And I think that as hunters, we probably thinking about it almost more seasonally, right? And I think,
Hmm.
and if I were to venture a guess, I don't think anyone would kind of frame it this way, just in a podcast conversation. But I would bet dollar to donuts the guys that are killing mature deer consistently may not think of it that way, but that's how they break down their hunts. Is that they think
Yeah.
about the home range of the deer, and I think how we talk about it in kind of colloquial terms or in hunter terms is probably, especially when we talk about October, is chasing the food sources, right? Because
Hmm.
you hear a lot of hunters. I mean, that we talk a lot about making sure what is the dominant food source in your particular area for that 2-3 days you have to hunt during that week or whatever the case is, because chances are that's where the deer are going to be congregating. Um,
Yeah.
and that's like the deer hunter way of saying it. But what they're really doing is chasing that deer's home range based on how he's shifting.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah,
Well said. Well said. Exactly.
yeah, that's
And
amazing.
another thing that's interesting about these shifts is they can be, the time can correspond very well from year to year. Now I'm not talking about just 50 acres one day and moving over 50 acres, but coming to a new area. So like one of these deals before the rut, and you have a shift where, again, look, you were looking at our stuff on Instagram, you saw some pretty fantastic examples we've
Hmm.
posted where some of these bucks will go over 10 miles.
Yeah,
They'll spend a whole bunch of time during the summer in one spot, a whole bunch of time pre-rut, and then bam, they shift and move 10 miles away. What is really, to me, I think the most interesting part of that is the internal clock that they have. There's a lot of repeatability from year to year when they do this. And really, there's a lot of good hunters out there that over the years, from their trail camera inventory, remember and document that this camera in this woodlot or whatever, this trail, I started picking up this buck on this day or this week. And if you're letting those good antlered middle aged bucks pass, like I hope we are, that's something to keep in mind, that that place where you had the sighting or that place where you got the photo of it, you need to think about literally being in that spot next year and hunting that for a couple days the next year, because the data are saying that's pretty reliable.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that because one of the things over the past probably I run a fair amount of trail cameras, um, and one of the things after I kind of had enough data on a couple of the pieces that I hunt locally, um, to me, I primarily kind of focus on a lot of kind of community kind of scrape areas. Is a lot of what I kind of try to spend my time around, and what I've kind of found, especially around those areas, um, I actually hunt dates more than I hunt almost anything else. Like even more so than like terrain features and stuff like that, so to speak, because I've watched over the course of a handful of years. I'll just give you an example. So last year was, I think, the for not this past season, but the season before. Um, there was a really good deer I was chasing in a particular area, and I had him on trail camera earlier in the year, and I couldn't quite catch up with him. I missed him by like a day here and there. He was a really good buck. And but what I had noticed was like, this one area just really kind of turned on at a specific time. This deer showed up earlier than usual, right? Like it wasn't rut. It was around like the 15th of October here in the northeastern Pennsylvania, right? So that's we're not kind of into pre-rut yet. We're kind of there's just starting to check some things out, but maybe is one way to phrase it. And I was like, you know what? The next year, I was like, as long as I have the right wind, I was like, I'm gonna go in and hunt that date or the day before or day after, depending on when I get the right wind. I was like, I have a feeling that
Hmm.
that buck or a mature buck will be back, because I started looking back through a bunch of my trail camera pictures over the course of, like, regardless of where it was at, around that kind of time frame. And then I talked to a couple of my buddies who also run a lot of trail cameras, and what we kind of realized was that all of us, or the three of us, have always seen the first mature deer in an area will come 10 days scrape, or at least check it, usually in that kind of like anywhere from like the 10th to like the 15th, 12th, 16th, somewhere in there, a day or two on either side, give or take. But in that time frame, he'll give you one chance to kill him before, like, essentially before rut happens, right? And if you're there, then you're in the
Hmm.
chips. If you're not, then you probably are going to have to wait and just take your chances during the rut. And so, in going back and looking at all that, I started kind of paying more attention to that stuff. And sure enough, this year I sat that spot 1 year to the date, and it wasn't the same buck, but it was a mature deer that I had on camera earlier in the year, and he's the one who came through at like 3 o'clock in the afternoon, same day.
I'll be.
Yeah.
Wow.
And I started, so it got me thinking. I started going back and looking at other spots that I had, and I don't want to say I hunt exclusively like that, but if there are a particular deer that I'm trying to kill, or like maybe two or three that I'm like, okay, any one of these three will do, I start following them in that regard, in relationship to dates. And then I'll figure out what dates they're going to be in what areas, and then that's where I go hunt them once I have the right wind.
I think that is really smart. Really, really smart. Yeah.
And I had a bunch of great encounters last year using that. That deer I should have killed. He was at 18 yards, and he came. I was expecting him to come from the north. He came from, or actually, I was expecting him to come from the east, and he came from the west. So he kind of surprised me, and I saw him too late. I didn't know which deer it was right away because his head was behind some brush. I couldn't tell which buck it was. One I wanted to shoot, one I was going to let go. And by the time I could tell which one he was, I didn't have time to get my bow back. I didn't have enough cover between he and I to make it happen, is the moral of the story. But
Right.
it was just interesting hearing you say that, because that's something I've actually taken to heart and hunt almost, I don't want to say exclusively, but it is probably like 70% of my strategy,
Hmm.
year in and year out.
I think that is really wise. And stories like you and other, I mean, I've just heard it so often recently. Uh, Hunters in the Midwest, especially where you have, very distinct areas where cover is going to be. They've been doing this for a really long time, and it's just fascinating with the GPS collar data we have now, that it fully supports that.
Yeah.
What hunters have been seeing, it can be fully explained with the data we're collecting. So,
Yeah. I
really
mean,
smart way to go about it.
yeah, I mean, the data will just tell you if you just pay attention to it, because, that same spot, it's, uh, I had always hypothesized that there was always an early doe in that area. but could never
Hmm.
prove it. But this year I got uh, a, a fawn drop, and based on backdating the date of the fawn, that doe would have had to been bred somewhere between the 15th and the 19th of October, like around the 20th. Like I guess would be like somewhere between like the 15th and the 20th that week.
Oh,
In order,
so for you, that's about 2 weeks ahead of peak.
yeah, yeah. And so
Yeah.
and it told me a lot because I was like, all right, well, and then the other thing I do is like I kind of figure out like when does are going to come in, and doe family groups keep their doe estrus date from that's passed on from the mom. So as long as the family group stays intact, like that
Hmm.
area should turn on the same time year over year over year. And so I use that
Right.
coupled with like my truck camera data, coupled with fawn drop dates and stuff like that to kind of figure out when my prime times are, because I can probably get prime hunts 2 to 3 different times if I know all those things, as opposed to just relying on rut or peak or pre-rut or whatever the case is. I probably have a good date early. I probably have a good date in pre-rut, and I probably have a good date during rut.
Clint, that is really strategic. I think that is a really smart strategy right there.
So
Good advice.
yeah, I
Hmm.
should have went to school for wildlife biology, man. I think I missed my calling. So,
Well, you might have kept me from a job, so I'm glad you didn't.
so man, one last thing I want to transition to here, a couple points is just I know you guys have done a lot of observations related to pressure and decreased movement during daylight hours and things of that nature, and I think that's one of those things I think where hunter intuition is on the right side of the data, maybe is one way to say it, right? But I'm just curious, when you guys look at that, is there any type of break point of the amount of pressure or the time, maybe the duration of pressure might be a better way to say it, that a buck will withstand before he begins really kind of reducing his daylight movement?
Um, yeah, and we'll have this fully described with graphs and so forth in this document we put out this fall. But it was really hard to find those threshold, those breaking points you're talking about. And what we decided to do was we broke hunting pressure up into thirds. And what I mean by that is during the hunting season, there's always going to be some element of pressure. And and I think a lot of people think that hunting pressure is only defined as an encounter with the deer where the deer realizes a hunter is in a stand or cuts your trail and the deer blows and runs off. But I think pressure is deer just realizing that over time, hunters are in the field. They are also hearing ATVs, they're hearing truck doors slam, their human scent is wafting all around. And so, what we did, the way we broke it up, was using the days where we know how many hunters were on the study area on a particular day. And we had it into the lower 33%, the middle 33%, and the upper 33%. And really, it was that upper 33% is where we saw most of a behavioral change. The thing about it is that the behavioral change wasn't predictable in where the bucks are going to go. So let me lay out like we would hope we would have found. Let's come up with, say, two forest types. Again, this is just out of simplicity. Let's say that when there's no hunting pressure, deer or bucks are more often in the upland hardwoods where our acorn producing tree, and that's where the deer are at. And then hunters come in, bow hunters, et cetera. They figure out hunters are there. So they move to the bottomland hardwoods where it may not be as accessible, because of swampland and so forth.
Right.
But we didn't see that. What we found is that when hunting pressure got worse and worse, or when hunting pressure was at its extreme, is there was no pattern. There was no pattern whatsoever. So individual bucks were making individual decisions on where they spent time. And keep in mind, all we can do to classify what we would call a vegetation type is what the satellite and aerial photos give us. And so we typically break them down into, like I mentioned, this pine or conifer forest or evergreen forest or upland hardwoods or bottomland hardwoods or fallow field or herbaceous area, things like that. And when hunting pressure was again that top 33%, there was no discernible, definable pattern whatsoever. And kind of going back to something you alluded to earlier, what we think is that when the pressure is on, individually these bucks are just figuring out where these safe spots are at and where they can hunker down. And it does not matter if the surrounding forest type or vegetation type is bottomland hardwood, if it's a fallow field, if it's an upland hardwood pine, it doesn't matter. There was no pattern. They just go to places where they know they're going to be safe.
So as a whole, there's no what. So let me ask this: was there when they found safety, and not as a group, but say, was there an individual buck or that you saw that once he found safety, that was a spot of consistency for him, but as a group, they were kind of there was not a pattern as a group, or did you see any patterns emerge on an individual basis?
I can't answer that very well. That's going to be part of this next
Got
analysis.
it. Okay.
But if I were to, based on the previous analyses, I would say that it's going to be very individualistic.
Hmm. Okay.
And a particular buck, being an individual, will probably have several spots that he goes, but you're not going to be able to use the overstory vegetation to predict where that spot is going to be.
Right. Right.
It's all going to be based on, it doesn't matter if the overstory is oak trees, pine trees, whatever.
Right.
It's going to be what is the composition underneath.
So how long after? So when you have a place that's pressured, right, and you see them, kind of scattering with very little, to no predictability. How long after, I guess, the height of the pressure that they've received has kind of waned? How long after that do they resume back to kind of normal, you know, normal travel, normal daylight activity, in or are they permanently kind of scarred, if you will, and that they kind of remain altered for a pretty significant period of time?
I think there have been two analyses done that speak to that pretty well. And one of them was at MSU and one of them was at Auburn. The one at MSU was more about how much time pressured, how many days of pressure does it take before a buck starts altering its behavior? And that was essentially 3 days.
Hmm.
After 3 or more days, the movement characteristics of the buck started changing. And so he may be still in a general area, Clint, but how he navigates the landscape is decidedly different than before that disturbance took place. Now, on the follow up, Auburn, they did a wonderful study too. The way they looked at it was they kept track of where these GPS collared bucks were and places where hunters were. So they know the point in time a hunter was here at this stand and a hunter was there at that stand. And then they went and looked at 1 day after, 2 day after, 3 day after, et cetera, et cetera. And it took about 5 days before a buck was going to come into sightability. I think that's the right metric they use, but kind of sightability of that stand. So more or less, it was once the buck knew a hunter was there, it was close to a week before he was going to feel comfortable coming back into that general area again.
Yeah. So the moral of the story there is don't be detected.
Yeah.
It's
Pick your days, have
yeah,
an exit strategy, think about the wind. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. Is there anything in all the buck movement kind of work that you've done that stands out to you? Is there anything that has surprised you? Like when you think back of all the work that you've done, like whether it's the bedding stuff or whether it's the pressure, daylight movement kind of work, is there anything to you that really kind of stands out where you're like, man, that was pretty surprising, even like either as a hunter or even academically?
I'm probably going to deflate the balloon here. um, the thing that I think I have enjoyed the most, and not because people want to argue about it or anything like that. It's again being a hunter and me having those preconceived from my experiences and talking to other hunters is just about general movements relative to certain conditions. And the one thing that's very obvious with the data, and it's very gratifying to me to hear other researchers in other states say very similar things. I was listening to Dwayne Diefenbach from Penn State, what was interviewed a couple weeks ago, and he was basically saying the same thing. There's just really not this predictable event other than the rut, that's really going to change their movement dynamics. Um, but if you think about it like this, Clint, deer have to eat every day, plain and simple. They got to eat every day. Those movements generally are going to be based around sun up and sundown. Now, some days they might move a little earlier, some days they might move a little later, but they're centered on the sun coming up and the sun coming down. And let me ask you, Clint, does the moon being full or not, does it affect your appetite?
It does not.
It doesn't affect mine either. I get hungry every day,
Yeah.
and it doesn't matter if it's a full moon or a new moon or anything like that.
Right.
And that's just what we see. Now that is not to say that there aren't particular bucks. There's always going to be an individual buck that may follow a pattern. And hey, if you can pattern an individual buck, we look at everything collectively at a population scale and we talk about the averages. So, hunting wise, if you've got a system that works with you relative to weather, relative to the moon, I'm in no way at all discouraging that or saying it's not real and doesn't work. If it works, keep doing it. But the advice that we give is when you look at 50 or 60 bucks with collars on them and looking at their behavior over 2 to 3 years, these are just our findings. Deer move every single day.
Yeah. Yeah. It's funny that you went there because I was actually, as you were going, I was like, is he gonna hit the moon? Because that was gonna be my next question. I've watched it in the past. I hunted a season by it, just because I was curious, and I didn't see anything that would make me say that I'm only going to follow the moon and hunt. Put it that way. So I really don't follow it with any kind of with any vigor any longer. What I will pay attention to only, and this is just again another piece of hunting kind of uh, I guess anecdotal evidence or information, is just I do like to kind of hunt just I guess right after a full moon, just because there's more light in the sky, and so I feel like they will come back to bed just a little bit later. So if I want to hunt a morning, I can get an opportunity potentially. That might be the thing that delays them and keeps them out in a food source for 15 minutes longer than it typically would. That gives me that 15 minutes of shootable light that I might get. That's really the only thing that I pay attention to is things like that. But yeah, there's a lot of people that swear by it. There's a lot of people I know who kill deer by it, and I'm the same as you. I'm like, man, if it works for you and it's what it takes for you to be confident in the field, then confidence is a hell of a drug.
That's right. The placebo effect can be really, really powerful.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
Well, hey, I
Yeah.
want to be sensitive to your time, buddy. I appreciate you coming on. I always enjoy talking to you. I can't wait for that for those sheets to come out. I'm going to be
Yeah.
in line to download those. But before I let you go, let people know where they can find out more about the things you guys are working on, the second part of this bedding study that you guys kind of have going on, and where they can find that sheet when those sheets are available this fall.
Yeah, sure thing. So you can always keep in touch with us on social media, and that is Facebook as well as Instagram, Twitter, and we're really starting to develop our YouTube channel more, and so that is growing. We're really trying to add videos to that. The discussion that we do, we try to do one every 3 weeks to a month, and I wish we could do more. It's just time is limited, but we have a podcast called Deer University. And so when this publication on all of this deer movement data is ready to go online, we will make sure to post that everywhere on all the social media accounts, on our podcast, etc. We'll actually even have a download link. Will be on our website, which is msudeerlab.com. So you can go there and download it as well. But we will be sure to make sure everyone knows. We'll get it out there that it's available and available.
Awesome. Well, hey, I appreciate you coming on. Good luck this fall, and hopefully you don't have to wait till retirement to get out a few more days.
Thank you, Clint. Always appreciate the opportunity to talk to you. And thank you very much. Enjoyed it.
All right, folks, that is a wrap for today's show. I'd like to thank all of you for listening. If you haven't yet, please head over to iTunes and leave us a 5-star rating, and be sure to subscribe to the podcast. And while you're at it, head over to YouTube and give us a sub there as well. I'd be super appreciative if you do those couple things for me. And before I shut this thing down, I need to give a big shout out to our partners who continue to help us make this podcast possible. Tethered, Spartan Forge, Exodus, and Skull Brew Coffee Company. And until next time, we'll see y'all.